Hey everybody! In today's video, I'm going to show you a variation on my Blackout embossing folder technique. I love this technique. Y'all love this technique. And this is just a different variation on it with distress oxides. Now, you will need a plastic or a metal spoon and your re-inker for your oxide ink pad, because you want a ton of ink in the ink pad to do this technique, and you'll see why in just a little bit. So even if you feel like your ink pad is well inked, go ahead and ink it to the point where it's not absorbing ink anymore, and I'll show you what that looks like. I actually don't use my black soot ink pad all that often when I'm not doing like a galaxy background. That's primarily what I use it for. So my ink pad was a little bit dry. So what I do is just use the back of the spoon to smooth the re-inker into the ink pad very, very evenly. This is the best way to ink any kind of ink pad that you have. So make sure, especially with distress oxides, that it is shaken very well. There is a bead in the bottom of distress oxide re-inkers that you will hear shaking. And I noticed I was getting some separation, so I went ahead and shook mine again mid re-ink. So I'm just repeating the process, getting all of the ink smoothed into the ink pad with the spoon after each application of ink. It's better to do this in little increments than to just, pour half a cup of ink onto this and try to get it to soak into the pad. So it's kind of a repetitive process, but it's really worth it, because especially if you're using this ink to stamp, now see how it's kind of shiny? It's not really going back into the ink pad. That's how you know you're done. But especially if you're using the ink to stamp, this type of re-inking technique really makes it stamp evenly, and the ink is distributed evenly across the felt or the linen or whatever kind of ink pad you have. Now I have this beautiful ombre paper. You can see this kind of goes with this month's theme on the back. It is two-sided and it's already pre-cut into this size, so that's very convenient. So I'm going to start this like you would start my blackout technique, but you'll notice that distress oxides bead up on this plastic. And a lot of ink pads will do this, so I'm not saying you have to use this exact type of ink. You can just experiment with what you have. But I really like the way the oxides look with this, so that's what I'm using. The other technique, the blackout technique, you'll want to use an ink that has a smoothing agent in it that really grabs onto that plastic and doesn't bead. Now I want you to put a ton of ink onto the flat side of your embossing folder, and you'll see why. So you can see there's just so much ink on there and big beads of ink, and that's really important to the technique. Then carefully close the embossing folder without making sure your paper doesn't move, and run it through your machine. Now you can see those dots that I had on there, they spread out and they get really, really dramatic. And that's what gives you this distressed blackout look. And the more ink you have, the more of these big kind of blotchy areas you'll have. It sort of looks like an old etching kind of. And I love the way it works, because you get a bunch of different textures. You get some very fine dots, and you get these big blotchy dots on your background, and it gives it an overall distressed look, I guess. So it's distress oxides. It's a distressed look. Now you will want to dry this. If you are using an ink like a distress oxide, you're going to need to dry this very thoroughly, especially if you're going to do a little highlighting technique like I'm going to do in just a second. But even before you move on to keep working on the card, and I can see there's still some little wet spots where they were beaded up. So I just blotted those, and then I'm heat setting it again. And that's really important, because this can get a little bit messy if everything isn't completely dry. So be sure and do that. So I'm going to take this Brilliant White pigment ink and I'm going to do one more little subtle detail on here. One of the things about using pattern paper, as you can see here, there are places where the colored part cracks a little bit. This is kind of a fun free distressing, and it can add little white spots to your embossed paper, especially if you're using a 3D embossing folder, which can put a little more stress onto the paper and cause that cracking. And what you can do is just kind of lean into that look and add additional white highlights just here and there. I'm not going to add these on every flower, but it just gives the look of purposefulness to that free highlight that you get with thinner colored paper that you're embossing. So anything with a white core or that has colored printing on top of it, like this paper does, will crack on you sometimes depending on the pressure in your machine and what kind of embossing folder you're using. So I say just go with it and add yourself some more white highlights, which is a technique that I've done in many, many videos. And I can put some of those on the screen so you can check those out. But that is a beautiful overall look. It looks kind of vintage. And like I said, like an etching with that textured response that you get in the background from kind of a modified blackout technique. So head over to my blog for more information, and thanks so much for watching.